Hi everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. My name is Philip Eidson. I'm the co-founder and the managing director here at Art of Procurement. I'm joined by my co-founder, Kelly Barner. Welcome to the webinar, Kelly.
Hi, Phil. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you everybody who has either joined us live or is listening to us later or watching on demand.
Absolutely. We really appreciate you joining us today. And if today is the first time you've joined us at an AOP Live webinar, it's really all about the questions. There are no slides, so it's interview style. And we just invite you, as we're going through today's conversation, please don't be shy. You can always pop questions in the chat session. The chat is in the, you see the sidebar at the side of the screen. There is a Q&A section as well, but it's probably easier if you put those questions in the chat. Kelly and I will be keeping our eye on those as we go through the conversation, and we'll bring any on stage as we can do. Now, today's topic, we titled this Sourcing Strategically in Chaotic Conditions. I think there's a lot of chaos going around us. Certainly all the CPOs that we talk to on a regular basis are figuring out how do we deal with everything, or what do we not do because of everything around us. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that. We're going to be bringing in just some discussion around going back to basics and some procurement fundamentals as ways that we can really manage the chaos around us, and the importance of kind of keeping our eyes on delivering multiple forms of value. It's not just all about costs, so how can we make sure that we are doing that in our strategies? Now, our guest today is Adam Collins. Adam is part of the team at Esker. Esker is a SaaS company. They have a suite of products that focused on activities that all roll up to the office of the CFO, including procurement, with capabilities across the source to pay continuum. Now, Adam himself has been in procurement technology space for about 7 years, predominantly focused on the source to contract. So without further ado, let's invite Adam onto the stage.
Hello, Kelly. Hello, Phil. How are you?
As if by magic.
There you go. Look at that. Technology, eh?
Well, thanks for joining us today, Adam.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, been looking forward to this for a while now.
Now, we always start with, kind of a traditional question, which is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Well, I could argue that I've been in procurement ever since I was a child, because I was very good at spending my parents' money. But in reality,
you were a stakeholder.
Yeah, I was a stakeholder, key stakeholder, not a budget holder, but a great spender of said budget. But no, in all seriousness, I think like most, I kind of fell into procurement. My background has always been in technology. Service delivery was kind of my predominant area of focus, but I actually came from a telecommunications company. And then I stumbled upon Market Dojo, which in turn became part of Esker, which is where I find myself today. And to be honest, like up until about sort of 8-9 years ago, I didn't really know what procurement was. I kind of knew they were a function in the business, but I didn't know too much about what they really did. So yeah, it's my first, let's call it gig, directly involved in procurement. And yeah, I've learned a tremendous amount over the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of us don't have a clue what procurement is. I think it's something we've got to change, as a profession. Sure. But we didn't know what procurement was, and then you start doing it, and you think, actually, I don't mind a bit of this, and you find ourselves still in it 25 years later. So, it kind of drags you in and then keeps you. Yeah. Now, when we talk about today's business conditions, we talked about, use the term chaos, but I wonder if you could just break that down into something that's a bit more manageable, or, that's kind of reflective of the things that we actually do and face on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think to sort of break down what we mean by the term chaos right here, right now, sort of halfway through 2025, I think we'll talk about things like tariffs. I think that's a bit of a dirty word that's been flown around a lot over the last 6-7 months. But then aside from that, obviously things like geopolitical tensions, war in certain parts of the world at the moment, the Middle East, as well as Eastern Europe. And then in addition to that, just supply chain disruptions, I think as well, that's been something that I still feel we're feeling the after effect even from COVID today, with regards to how some organizations still haven't quite settled back down from that. So I would define that chaos as today's current affairs. I would also say that procurement is always chaotic. There's always something around the corner, but right now that's really what we're focusing on.
It's funny, you know, I the term that came into my head was the new normal, and I hate using that term because I think it was really overused during COVID times. But it certainly seems as though the days of being able to plan out, you know, a 3-year strategy and being pretty comfortable that you can, you know, I think about earlier in my career, I told myself that's what I was paid for. I was paid to kind of understand what the future would probably look like and then build strategies around how do we take advantage of that. And yes, you can still do that, but I think those timeframes are really compressed now, and it doesn't take much to you know, kind of put everything back on the drawing board, take everything back to the drawing board.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's no such thing as the new normal because you know, tomorrow is another day, right?
Yeah, I'm actually, as we record this, I'm here in Canada, and Canada is certainly feeling the brunt of the tariffs as an example right now. I'll be at an event later in the week, and every single thing on the agenda is really related to kind of Canada's place in supply chain, but also tariffs, and how does that impact global supply chains? So it's certainly a topic that's not going away.
Sure.
Now, when you think about procurement skills and talents, what have you seen being most effective with the companies that you work with in, you know, being most successful during all these unpredictable times?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the midst of what's going on right now, and I think it's fair to say that, you know, we refer to that term that the new normal may never come. So people, you know, might end up just having to execute without hesitation by this point. But if I do go back to, I draw comparison enormously to the COVID situation. And the reason why I do that is because it was something that really came out of the blue. It meant that a lot of organizations all of a sudden had to kind of survive rather than thrive, I think is the term that I like to sort of use with regard to that. And there was a lot of internal firefighting. You know, there was a lot of batten down the hatches. We need to figure out how we can navigate our way through this right now. And then, you know, slowly, there was a little bit more confidence and the ability to kind of go back out onto the market and, you know, see how solutions and, you know, plans, etc., execution of business strategy could actually help navigate through that. And some of those skills that I saw then and I'm starting to see now are things like just keeping a calm head. I think that's so important. And I think actually, what is it they say, like with adversity comes opportunity. And quite often this is a time when procurement really stands up and shows its worth to the business. So keeping a calm head is such a key thing, not making any kind of non-fact-based decisions. I'm always a big believer in having, you know, facts in front of you. When I say facts, I'm talking about access to kind of data, live data especially, can really help you make, you know, conscious decisions as to how you can pivot. I think having obviously a broad supply chain always helps. I think that was where a lot of people came unstuck during COVID, you know, single source, all of a sudden, you know, nowhere to be seen. Another disruption actually around them was the kind of Suez Canal blockage. I think that happened in like 21, 22. And again, you know, that caused a huge challenge with things like lead times and, you know, supply outweighing demand, etc. Sorry, demand outweighing supply. So again, you know, those fact-based decision-making kind of approach, attitude, if you will, is key too. I also like that procurement tend to be, or like to be, I should say, proactive rather than reactive. So kind of getting ahead of the curve and future-proofing. And again, a lot of that can be driven by having broad supply chain, having many options on the table, the ability to adapt. You know, procurement people sometimes are like chameleons, like they're constantly having to change their colors and pivot in different directions and be agile, like so agile. And it's almost like an unsung, thankless task in many ways. But this is a time when those persons can really stand up to their business. I like the whole narrative of being proactive rather than reactive, because if you can just get yourself ahead of the curve and almost have a procurement disaster recovery plan, or whatever you want to call it, the equivalent of, it can certainly help make this a lot smoother. No one knows what the right or wrong answers are going to be until we truly know what the new normal may be, if that ever comes. But what we certainly can do is, you know, damage limitation, get in front of the curve, make sure we're not putting ourselves at a huge amount of risk by having a single source, for example, and also just making sure we got that data in front of us. Those are my key points on the procurement skills there.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that you said there. One is, when there is uncertainty like there is today, the leadership within any organization looks to procurement and supply chain colleagues as the voice of reason. Like, help me understand this, help me figure out this. And it gives you a platform that we don't get when there's a lot less uncertainty within the business. And so I always see this as being a really good opportunity to kind of step up and take advantage of that. We ask for it all the time. And then the important thing is, you can then be, run the risk of being rabbit in headlights if you don't have the information that you need when you were asked for that. So there's a lot of preparation and that proactiveness, as you talked about before, that goes into being ready for that moment. But how you handle that moment is a big driver of the future perception of the procurement organization. The other thing you just talked about, having disaster recovery plans. I just wanted to kind of call out what I think is, when we think about business continuity and disaster recovery plans, what I don't think we do enough of is look at that at a category level.
Right.
So oftentimes we look at it at a supplier level and say, okay, if this supplier, something happens with supplier A, then I'm going to go and use supplier B. But these supply chains are so interconnected that the likelihood is if something affects supplier A, the same thing is going to affect supplier B.
Right.
We don't necessarily know what's all hidden kind of underneath the hood and how they're all connected. So thinking about continuity plans at that category level rather than supplier level, really important.
Sure. No, I totally agree. And again, regional factors come into this enormously. Again, without trying to make it a tariff fest, if you will, one of the things that has come from that is where companies are just trying to identify vendors that are in situ, especially in America itself. I felt the pinch with regards to the respective markets across Canada and North America. Canada and the United States, mainland America, and just trying to broaden their options or widen their options closer to home has been one of the more prevalent objectives over the last 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. With your background at Market Dojo, I think it makes sense to just talk a little bit about auctions. And
sure.
The perception is probably the use of auction as a single tool to do one job. And of course, it's a lot more than that. Where do you see that auctions belong in a procurement strategy and addressing this or helping to understand and address this uncertainty?
Oh, you've lit the fuse now, Philip, because auctions are my baby. And again, pre-procurement, I always just treat auctions or identified auctions as eBay. Like that was my, or the old school, the gavel, like at the antiques hall, was what my understanding of auctions was. But I know a bit more about those now. So just at high level, I am a massive believer of if you can define it, you can source it. And if you can source it, you can auction it, which is a very sweeping statement. But really, the fundamentals for a successful e-auction are two things: clear scope and competition. There is no reason why you can't potentially take something to an e-auction if you have both of those things. And I think there is a common misconception, and we hear this a lot, as a provider of said technology, that's not fit for purpose for what we source. Okay, fine. It might not be fit for purpose for direct sourcing where you genuinely have only one vendor that you can work with, and it's critical to, a particular component or a particular item or garment even, or whatever it may be that goes into your actual, product. However, I bet you there's a lot of back office spend that you're not even aware of how much it actually amounts to, that if you did consolidate that, you could genuinely put out to tender. And we've helped many companies approach auctions in a much more dynamic way, and almost kind of given them a whole new perspective of how they can be successful and how they're not just there to, necessarily be a race to the bottom, because again, that's not really what auctions have to be about. Certainly not when you're doing a kind of qualitative evaluation alongside the commercial aspect, which of course is something our technology offers. So I think they lend themselves really nicely to an opportunity where right now organizations can sort of fight back against potential vendors trying to take advantage of tariffs. And I've heard of this with regards to premeditated price increases as soon as the US election happened, which I think was back in November now.
Yep.
Almost just like we'll kind of slide a 7-8% increase there because we think these tariffs are going to happen anyway. I think as well, what it can also do is it can uncover that you might think you've got the best market rate for however long you've worked with said vendor, but actually an auction, again, I've seen this for myself many times, can quite often uncover bad procurement. Like, oh, how come all of a sudden now my supplier, my trusted supplier I've worked with for the last 5-7 years, they're willing to take part in an auction, but 3 or 4 minutes into it, they're coming down 15%. What's that all about? Like, have I been paying 15% over market rate for the last however long? And again, like quite often, just that whole psychology and dynamic of just, bringing a bit of competition to the table can make a huge amount of difference. But they only really work if people are transparent with the suppliers in the first place. I think it's so important. There's a lot more upfront work with an e-auction for a very short-term, potentially lucrative gain. Right? Which is all about just making sure, A, you're transparent with the vendors, B, you've got that competition, and C, you're clearly defining what it is you're asking people to bid on. Because if you can do those things, you will run a successful auction no matter what the category is. And to give you some examples, we've seen temporary labor be auctioned, we've seen energy be auctioned, we've seen mechanical components be auctioned, we've seen people's time being auctioned, security services, HR services, snow removal services, you name it. Again, not the norm that you would expect to auction, because a lot of people say, oh yeah, that's great for widgets and SKUs or whatever. But actually, no, like if you can define it and there's competition, you can auction it. What I must state is that is just one tool in your belt. You don't always have to go to an e-auction, and that's not what I'm saying. But what I am absolutely advocating is that you should have a broader mind about how you approach these things, because I promise you, if you do all of that upfront work, you can create some incredible outcomes in a very short space of time, and a long-term new partnership with a prospective vendor that you didn't know 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I do want to say, in the early days, that was my perception too. My perception was, oh, well, this is unique and I can't use an auction for this. And it took a lot of, opening of my eyes. And I think that included, 10 plus years ago, talking with Alan Rafiq, one of the co-founders of Market Dojo, about all the different things that Market Dojo was running through auctions. For you actually to realize that is so many other parts of that go into determining your sourcing strategy and the tools that you use, but nothing should be off the table. Right, in terms of categories. And Kelly, let me bring you into the conversation. As you think back to your practitioner days, where would you be bringing auctions in right now?
Yeah, and it's interesting because listening to Adam talk about it, I'm thinking, right, everybody always assumes that what do you auction? You auction widgets, where the only factor that's going to go into the final decision is price. And I would say that is absolutely a misconception. The way I had the opportunity to learn about auctions is that they're really about two things: compression and showmanship. So it's less about that race to the bottom, Adam, and it's more about bringing everybody's prices closer so that they actually matter less. And you can let all of that other really important stuff, quality, innovation, right, risk, actually be what makes the determination versus cost. But it also compresses the time frame required to negotiate in.
Right.
Now, on the other side of things, nothing in the whole wide world is better than a really well-run auction with a war room. And for all of procurement's desire to be in the spotlight, you definitely don't want executives watching from the room you're administering the auction in. You want like a nicer, quieter place with a big screen, maybe some snacks, but you don't want them getting involved while you're attempting to actually do the technical work. But I think it's an amazing way to showcase what procurement can make happen very visually. Now, in order to pull that off, procurement has to know the market. And I actually think that, if anything, is the greatest barrier to auctions being used, because you have to have done all of that upfront work that you talked about, Adam. You really have to have a sense will the prices come down, and to what degree? It's not to say that you can't be surprised, but you really have to know how much competition do we have and can we leverage it? And so you're doing a lot of upfront work, but I think you end up getting more credit for it if that work is carried out in a way that other people get to be a live part of.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, to be honest, Kelly. And we've had scenarios where we've held the hand of a customer that, a new person has come into the organization. They've come from having access to technology like auctions or, weighted evaluation technology as well. And it's very greenfield, like, oh, we just tender out of a mailbox or we just pick the phone up. And they're like, well, no, hang on, like, come on. It's 2025. Like, there has to be a better way to do things. And I know that auctions in a previous life work really well. So they've gone and introduced it. And the reason why they've done that with us is because we're able to offer a kind of on-demand model. So it kind of de-risks it in many ways. Like, people can just stand the tool up for a one-off event to kind of prove the concept, which is very unique in our space. Most organizations require a lengthy implementation and, minimum term commitment. But we've done that. We've had that whole boardroom, dialed in on a Teams call. They've got the boardroom all loaded up with their, procurement people initially, with maybe one C-suite member. And then by the end of it, you can see them like waving them into the room, like, come and see this. This is amazing. Like, and that is the fruits of the labor of all of that upfront work. And you're damn right, Kelly, when you say about doing that market research and to kind of compress the gap between, vendor A and vendor D, because it's not just about hitting vendors over the head on price. It's about making sure you're getting true market value. And there are so many other aspects that matter than purely price. We've not even touched upon like D&I and ESG, for example. Those things can be critical components that determine which vendor it is that you choose to move forwards with. And having all of that right in front of you is great. The final thing I'll say on that point is that when the C-suite see that, they say, great, now you've done that once. Go and get me the same saving across the rest of the categories.
Now, I see that there's a question that's coming from Renee, and actually I'm going to pose this, Kelly, first to you, and then to Adam as well. The question is, in chaotic environments in general, how can companies accelerate due diligence on vendors? Lowest price does not necessarily mean highest quality products or service. So essentially thinking about, okay, we're going to look at using an auction to accelerate price discovery, but pre that, so that we're ready to go, are the things we can do to accelerate due diligence so that we compress the whole schedule, the whole kind of the whole project, using both that due diligence and then go to auction. And so Kelly, I want to pose that to you, but then Adam, I'd love to hear kind of what you see from your clients in terms of how they think about that.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is I would typically start with another sort of unsung hero of procurement fundamentals, which is the RFI, right? You can do very basic background research, pre-qualify suppliers, get a very early idea on pricing. You can validate specs. You can do a lot very quickly with an RFI because there's less of an expectation that you're rolling straight to negotiation and contract from there. I would also say, to Adam's earlier point about being data-driven and fact-oriented, so much of what we hear that we would describe as chaotic doesn't actually end up applying to us specifically. So we might hear, oh my gosh, there's, they can't get grain out of Ukraine because of Russia's invasion. Oh my gosh, there's going to be an enormous situation. For those of us in the United States, our grain is not coming from Ukraine. So you read these very upsetting articles. Once you dig into the details, you find out, okay, parts of the world are being horribly impacted by this, but that's not us. And that same example can carry out with trade routes, can carry out with steel, can carry out with a lot of the different types of products and services that we might be buying. So always going to the data first, I think, sort of takes the emotion out of a lot of what we do. But in terms of speeding it up, I would say don't try to get so much done without leveraging suppliers' help. And to me, an RFI, quick and dirty if it has to be, throwing that out there, gathering information, so you're looking at supplier-provided facts, is a really good way to sort of jumpstart the process.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you've said there, Kelly. I think in many ways the auction is kind of the cherry on the cake, if you will. It's just the final part of all of that engagement that you've already done prior. And an e-auction can be a multifaceted exercise, like you've said. We've had many scenarios where our customer has initially gone out with that market engagement, or RFI, if you will, saying, hey, we know that we need to source this at some point. We think you can provide it. Give us your bio, tell us about your carbon emission strategy, and let us know about other vendors you service in this space, and so on and so forth. And then generally, as you go kind of a bit like a sales funnel, but let's call it an RFI funnel, you narrow your options down and you start getting into that finite detail about specs and what pricing might look like, so that you can benchmark, so that you've got a feel for whether or not there's actually competition here, which goes back to my earlier point of, if you've got competition, you can run an auction. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't want one vendor being 30% less than the other 15 vendors, because you've kind of got a monopoly there. They're not going to budge. Like, they're going to sit there and say, we know we're the only vendor you can rely on, so thank you very much. Let us know when we've won the business. We'll sign the contract when you're ready. So I'm talking about making sure that you do have, across 10 vendors, there's maybe a 20% difference in price. So that can very easily compress, like you've mentioned, Kelly, and then bring them closer to one another, to the point that when you do get into auction, you see this kind of incremental bidding, that then those very small, changes that might be at unit level $0.50 or $1 or $2 can have such a huge impact on something that could be potentially a 7-figure contractual value. So there's that incremental part, and it gets so exciting. I mean, I love this when you see like first, second, third, like changing every couple of minutes, because they're really fighting it out for your business. But the other thing I will say is that right at the very start of the whole process, there are a lot of tools out there that can kind of help speed up or expedite the kind of diligence with suppliers. There's a lot of supplier discovery tools. I mean, we partner with one ourselves, so people can kind of search and do that without having to trawl Google for hours and hours. It comes with intelligence, so you can kind of filter out vendors that don't have a certain accreditation, for example, or you only want to work with vendors that have a certain certification, whatever it may be. There are other tools as well that can do some kind of market benchmarking. I think there used to be a system called like What's the Price? I think you could literally Google it, and it generally would be on things that are a little bit more linear, so steel and raw materials and energy, etc. But I'm sure there are tools out there that you could do some research on to help provide you with a kind of benchmark for what the cost of something should look like in a particular region. And those things, again, will all just go into the whole fabric of how you approach the actual exercise when you get into the engagement with the vendors.
So as you think about that price discovery you just mentioned, you talked earlier as well about being proactive. When I think again about an auction, the perception of an auction is, I have something to buy, I've got a sourcing process, I will go and use it to negotiate the final price with whatever it is I buy. And that's almost reactive to a scope of work and a process with a beginning and an end. Can you use auction, and have you seen auction used to really just be proactive in terms of price discovery? And what I mean is, right now you're seeing all the cost increases that came through over the last few years that stuck through inflation, when maybe underlying conditions suggest that those shouldn't have stuck, or you are seeing tariffs and the tariff pressure. You talked earlier about seeing suppliers putting 7-8% cost increases just preemptively. Can you use auction as a tool to understand where the market is without necessarily it being an award at the end of it?
Yeah, I think you certainly can. I think, again, that comes down to how you approach it from a transparency standpoint. So if you're clear with the vendors that this is an early stage market engagement, perhaps you are contractually obliged to remain, working with the vendor for another 6, 9, 12 months. But the earlier you get ahead of the curve, the better you're going to set yourself up for success. Sort of like doing your homework, right? Rather than just walking into an exam thinking that you're going to nail it, which was my method, and it didn't really work out. So anyway, my point is, if you do your upfront, diligence, and you're transparent with the vendors to say, look, it's a bit of a market engagement. We want to get a feel for benchmarking of pricing. Equally, I realize that vendors, they might say, well, look, this pricing is today, but we can't guarantee what it's going to be in the future. But even so, you've opened up a line of communication to get a feel for where they're at today. And, barring any absolutely dramatic market conditions, which, can happen, but barring that isn't the case in the next 3, 6, 12 months, that you could be potentially working with a vendor in the future that is in and around where you're looking to, be spending on a cost basis.
Yeah.
So there is that aspect of it. Again, I've seen people do this benchmarking exercise without any kind of committal to contract. If you stipulate that, conversely, we've seen people saying best bid will absolutely win this to make them get their claws out, if you will. But it doesn't have to be the case. Ultimately, the auction is a means of negotiation. It's not committing you to anything unless you say to the vendors that this is what we are going to be working with. Show us everything that you've got, basically.
And in competitive markets, have you seen any pushback from providers to participate in an auction under those conditions, with the knowledge that this is almost part of the RFI process, not necessarily part of the RFP process?
Yeah, I've seen it. And again, I think one thing that procurement can sometimes do a better job of is, going back perhaps one step. We work with a lot of companies that have quite a lot of branches or what do you call it, like silos or there may be one head office that has purchasing going on in 20 different places across the country. So again, I ask the question to these guys sometimes, well, you're going to source based on a potential 5-figure spend. If you actually do it at group level and put all of your baskets together, you could be looking at more of a 7, maybe even 8-figure spend.
Yeah.
And that then motivates the vendors a lot more than what, we're not going to auction, we're not going to try and win your business for peanuts, like actually, if you do your internal research and say, hey guys, we're buying it at this price, what are you buying at the minute? You might even find internally you're buying it from 2 different suppliers or even the same supplier for a different price. Let's what do you call it, like create a syndicate almost, let's group buy this, and then we can get the attention of the vendors that then all of a sudden are looking at a fairly lucrative long-term contract. So if that's something that is possible in your scenario, again, I would stipulate that at the very early stages of doing a market engagement. I think that's a really good, open, honest tactic. But at the same time, it can help save a huge amount of effort where several people are doing the same thing, but in silos, right? You know what I'm talking about? Almost like group purchasing or that kind of concept. I've seen it a lot. I've seen it a huge amount, where the same company are sourcing from 2 different vendors at 2 different prices for the same thing.
We talked about different that we shouldn't take anything off the table because of what it is in terms of whether you can run it through an auction. We often bump up against the idea of that spend really isn't addressable. It's not something that we in procurement should be touching on, and we're just kind of going to leave the status quo. Should we be challenging that, when we're talking to our stakeholders in terms of, or even ourselves? I think when we go through a spend analytics report, we say, yeah, I'm not going to worry about those things because I can't touch them. I'm just going to focus on this over there. Have you seen companies you work with challenge what it means to be addressable?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the most simplest way of defining it in my language is it's addressable because it's not been negotiated for a substantial period of time. And equally, it's addressable because you don't have a single vendor that genuinely is the only vendor that you can work with. More so on the direct side. I understand that there is always going to be some spend and some supply chain that you're just not going to disrupt because it's so mission critical, right? I understand that. But there's also sometimes this, how do I diplomatically say this? There's a bit of a pride and there's a little bit of a emotional aspect that sometimes comes into the individuals. Oh, I've always worked with that vendor and we're best mates, and I just pick the phone up and they're there the next day, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting the best price, and that doesn't mean you can't see what the market is saying. And there's no reason why you can't do some kind of benchmarking exercise. So I think sometimes I have to be careful. Like, I can't force people to do what I think is the right thing to do. Yeah. I'm not a practitioner myself. I go off of what I've seen other companies do that is somewhat brave sometimes, but has then gone on and made them look like superstars. And I've seen how they've done that, obviously utilizing tools like, sourcing software, auction tools, even just, onboarding solutions as well that can just help with that kind of upfront governance and diligence. But on that addressable spend aspect, I think you really need the individual to have the attitude of an open mind, and at the same time, not be afraid of, I don't want to say like upsetting the vendor, because the way you prevent that from being the case is that, again, you're transparent with them. Yeah. And I'm a vendor. We're a software company. I have customers that come up to their end of their contract, and I'm kind of thinking, okay, you're going to go back out to market. But it wouldn't be honest if I didn't practice what I preached. And I would completely understand if they were going to benchmark us against other solutions. Yeah. Hey, we signed up to you 3 years ago. What's new out there? What do you do now that you didn't do 3 years ago? Where's your kind of price point at? That's good procurement. Obviously I want them to stay with me, but I don't begrudge them for doing the right thing and making sure that they're not just, thinking that there is only one supplier that could possibly do what they're asking. So addressable spend, in my terminology, is that it's negotiable, and it hasn't actually been negotiated for some time. So let's actually inspect that and see whether or not we could make some savings there.
Kelly, do you feel like we should be challenging this notion of addressable spend?
I think we have to, partially because what procurement puts our time into has changed so much. And so fortunately, on the same relative timeline, we've actually had a lot of people distributed in the business stepping up and taking a more active role. I mean, sometimes it's literally sort of distributed sourcing or guided buying or whatever you want to talk about. But I think increasingly we're going from procurement addressing, which sort of applies that rolling up sleeves, getting dirty right into the mix, with some level of oversight where there might be a different group getting involved. Maybe it's a contract where you're not going to go out to bid for whatever series of reasons. And so the decision is made, we're going to manage this differently. Procurement can sort of monitor, but doesn't necessarily have to manage and drive. And I think as we, Phil, we talk about operating models all the time. As we decide where procurement is going to spend our time, spend our resources, invest in knowledge, I think how we look at addressing versus overseeing, at the very least, becomes something that we get to revisit and discuss so that we're doing what's right for our company in whatever business conditions we happen to be in. So Adam, let's actually pivot here. So we've talked a lot about sort of the chaos we're trying to thrive in, the procurement fundamentals that we can leverage. Let's talk a little bit about how procurement can work with suppliers within supply markets when conditions are destabilized. Let's just say that. Should we change the approach we use to analyzing a given market? Or can we look at that market in the same way we would have historically, but maybe instead challenge ourselves? Okay, don't assume that things are going to stay the way they currently are for quite as long. How does our market analysis change?
Yeah, I think people, again, it goes back to that core skill of having the agility and taking it on the basis of what today looks like and realizing that it may not be the same in a very short space of time. Yeah. Which is, again, something I actually did I can't remember if it was a presentation or another webinar where I spoke about the history of the chaotic times. I think I ended up going back to like 2008 and calling that the recent past, because I went right the way back to the recession. And I was like, oh, there's actually been quite a lot of disruption in all that time that, have obviously affected supply chain and procurement. But anyway, to your point, I do think that it does warrant procurement thinking a little bit more outside the box and not just thinking the tried and tested method that's, always worked for me is going to be the case moving forwards. I think there needs to be an element of absolutely agility. I keep using that word, but it is what that is. It's rigid. The opposite of rigid is basically what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And again, just having that line of communication with your supply chain, because sometimes procurement get blindsided by things that are completely preventable. And all that comes down to is that the only time you talk to your supplier is when you're placing an order. Like, actually, if you do something a little bit more, supplier relationship management, i.e. you have regular touch points with them on a regular basis, QBRs or, on sites, even if it is just a factory tour and a cup of tea, but at least you're having that line of communication and doing business face to face. You can kind of get that, candidness out of the vendors that can also perhaps potentially make you aware of, hey, do you know what? We're having supply issues ourselves, So we're trying to sort of look at how we can prevent that. So heads up, maybe just be mindful of this and we'll keep you posted over the next 2-3 months, whatever it may be. I think a lot of it breaks down where people are unwilling to break the mold. And also there's not a huge amount of conversation that goes on with the suppliers. And that's when the blindsidedness happens. That's when it's like, oh, COVID's happened or tariffs are now 50%. What do I do? And that's the whole notion of being reactive rather than proactive. And I don't like to see procurement in that spot.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate your point about procurement not wanting to break the mold, because the other thing we don't necessarily want to do in these conditions is rock the boat. Right? We've talked a lot about creating and leveraging competition, but if we're honest, we also don't want to make our current suppliers mad at us, right? I mean, it's very sort of fundamental, but you get nervous. What if they walk away and either don't finish the current contract, or then we're forced to switch, which increases disruption? Is there a way to get ahead of some of those risks so that we can both create the competition that's going to put us in the best position possible without sort of creating undue destabilization for the company as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, again, for me, it comes down to having that transparency and being completely open and honest, because even from my side of the table, as a salesperson with a solution that I want to offer to the entire market, I'm also a realist, and I hugely value, even when people are telling me, not necessarily good news, any line of communication is so useful for me, because I can then go and do something with that rather than being completely unknown as to whether or not anything's actually going to occur here, which becomes a huge frustrating wild goose chase, if you will. So I think, going back to my point with how that relates to procurement and suppliers and supply chain transparency, I just think the more open you are with, here's where we are, this is what we've done for X period of time, we want to continue doing that, but we also just want to make sure we're getting a fair price. So we're going to do XYZ market engagement. Times have changed. Now we're having to consider options that are a bit closer to home, for example. We're not saying that we're not doing business with you ever again. That's absolutely not the case. But it's all about just being transparent and making sure that you're equally not blindsiding your vendor into an unsolicited auction invite when they're like, whoa, hang on a minute, what's going on here? We were just about to re-sign, year 3 of our contract. Why are you chucking me in an auction? Oh, we're just doing that. You really have to make sure those, especially that you do business with and you have good relationships with, and you are getting what you deem to be a fair price at the moment, you're most honest and upfront with, because otherwise, yes, you can easily rock that boat and burn that bridge.
Yeah. Phil, it's funny because we talk about procurement being proactive, and I actually think it's important. We keep coming back to that today because this is an opportunity to do that. But being proactive doesn't mean going it alone. Right. And you've certainly done a lot of risk around sort of procurement program level risk in the past. Part of that is governance. Yeah. So how can procurement make sure, as a lot of these nuanced decisions need to be made around timing, around risk tolerance, around where are we actually willing to change, how can procurement make sure that they're actively, or I guess proactively, to stay with that theme, soliciting input from other functional leaders and decision makers within the business, so we have sort of the total picture to work on?
That's a good question. I think at the end of the day, we're being responsive to the risk tolerance of the businesses that we work for. And, those businesses have different levels of risk tolerance. It depends on what industry they're in. It may depend on whether they're regulated or not. It may just depend on, the tolerance of the individuals that work within the business. And so, and it can even be from stakeholder to stakeholder. So it's really important that we kind of connected in with how our organization thinks about risk and how our organization thinks about the cost of optionality, because the you mitigate risk by having options, by creating more options, but that comes with a price. That may come with a price in terms of what the total cost of buying something, but it comes with a price of how much work and effort needs to happen internally to build that optionality. So the way I look at it is this is also something that is not something you should be working at a individual stakeholder by stakeholder level, or even my marketing stakeholders here versus my HR stakeholders here versus your supply chain stakeholders there. We need to bring together kind of a cross-functional group of leaders to be talking about what's important to the business and where should we focus. Are there certain areas where we're more concerned about risk than others, so that all the efforts that we're doing are in alignment with the needs of the business, as opposed to us just kind of working on our own, thinking that this is where we need to mitigate risk when that might not be something the business cares about.
Yeah. That's something that we know all businesses care about. And maybe this is sort of starting to get into like the third rail of levers procurement has available, is payment timing, right? Everybody is concerned about cash on hand. Certainly the companies we work for, our suppliers as well. Yeah. It's something that can be negotiated into contracts. It's something that can be sort of, here's what's agreed, and then here's the reality we all know actually happens in practice. Adam, should we think of payment timing as a negotiating lever in contracts? Is that, again, sort of starting to cross that line of, yes, an opportunity, but very dangerous, especially in these chaotic times? Where do you think sort of working capital comes into all this?
Yeah, well, I've certainly seen it. The other things that I've seen negotiated, not necessarily in auction, but in auction and like just a general RFQ, are things like rebates and things like minimum order quantities and things like even the lead time can be negotiated, because if timing is of the essence, then that's more important maybe than the price, So I have seen those other things become a bit of a bargaining chip, and with various weightings applied to them based on the importance to the respective buying party. I think with where we are right now, it's also something that people can use to kind of help with, if we let you hold on to your cash a little bit longer, maybe you can help us with something else that we can agree to as a part of the TOS or the MSA, or, whatever gets drafted from a legal standpoint. But it's not uncommon. And I don't think necessarily that the chaotic times that we're in right now changes the dynamic with regard to that. I think, again, it's all just in the approach as to whether or not that's a factor that you want to put on the table and ask the vendors to kind of sharpen their pencil as much as they can. One of the key things we often see companies do if they are going out to auction is they will bake into a calculation considering the changing costs. Whilst our incumbent might be more expensive, think about what it might cost to then onboard a new vendor. Think about what it might cost to obviously get supply from a different part of the world or whatever it may be. So sometimes, it's not uncommon that there's a slight edge that's given to the incumbent, but all that means is that another vendor just needs to be that extra bit better on the qualitative part, or generous on the payment terms, or better on the lead time, that can then make them more attractive than the incumbent. So yes, again, it boils down to the fact that there are so many things that are on the table to be negotiated, potentially. Not necessarily every single thing that you go out to market for, but certain things.
Yeah. Now, I know we're starting to get close to time, and we'll sort of keep an eye. If you have any last minute questions, pop them in either the chat or the Q&A. Phil, one follow-up question to you based on what Adam was just saying. As you start to get into cash flows and working capital, now you're in finance territory, right? How financially literate does procurement really need to be if we're going to start wading into some of these waters and go beyond very simple, like, is it 30, 60 or 90 day, right? That's pretty high level. But as you start to think about how it affects your own company's finances, what level of literacy do we need to develop?
Honestly, I think we have to be as financially literate as our colleagues in finance. We need to understand the implications of some of the decisions that we make. It's interesting listening to the payment term discussion, and you think about I completely agree with everything that Adam said about the transparency, and it's part of a balanced negotiation around some give and some take, of which payment terms are part of that. What I struggle with is when we go with blanket requests to go and increase payment terms from 30 to 90 days or 60 to 90 days without taking that into account of what impact that's going to have on your supply base. And I think that can be really damaging unless you do it on a case-by-case basis and you think about who can, the affordability given the cost of capital of which of your suppliers can take that on versus which can't. A lot of small businesses really would struggle with something like that. All to say is you really need to understand the different ways that cash connects with treasury. What's your treasury folks doing, and how are they thinking about cost of capital, and what are decisions that you're making in that supply negotiation that could impact that? And I think that for a long time, and I speak from my personal experience when I was a practitioner, I know that I looked at that in a silo. I didn't look at the big picture of all these different levers that we could pull and negotiate, what impact it can have on the business. And you think, I want to be nice to my supplier and give them more aggressive payment terms. Well, there's got to be a good reason why you did that. And just make sure that you understand kind of all those things. And I think that at least when I was a practitioner, I didn't understand that interconnectedness as much as I should have done.
Yeah. And we actually have a question that's come in from Mike around this. So we've been talking about managing supplier and payment terms, but there's also the opportunistic side, which is potentially prompt payment discount.
Yeah.
I don't know if either of you want to offer up a comment on that.
I'd like to just jump in on that because we have been, as a business, a beneficiary of programs like that. But it goes down to transparency again. And the reason I say that, and it seems like a cliched answer, is when we're made aware that there are early payment programs for us to get payment early, that's going to come with a cost. You're going to give up a certain percentage to access those funds. What you don't know is what that cost of capital is going to be. So you end up putting assumptions in your pricing which turn out to be higher than the discount that you get, which means that it actually costs the provider more money in giving you that discount because you put your price up to account for the fact you're going to have to discount it to get access to the cash. So if you have programs like that, really being open about what the terms are going to be so that it can be built into the kind of commercial model, if you will, as you're putting together a proposal, I think that's important. Because otherwise you just end up playing with metrics, and the metric of how many companies took up your offer of giving a discount for prompt payment is the driving metric versus what my total cost of ownership was.
And I will add to that, because this is really Esker's wheelhouse when it comes to sort of de-siloing procurement and finance, right? And this is where the whole kind of downstream S2P solution comes into play. But I actually think, as to add to what you say, Philip, a lot of it is on a case by case. Like, what matters, it's a negotiation part again. Like, what matters most in this scenario, holding on to our cash longer or receiving the goods faster? And this is something that our technology can genuinely help with. We've got a lot of companies that use the kind of, okay, you've got X payment terms, but if you pay X days early, you actually get 0.5% rebate or whatever it may be. That environment is set up for specific vendors or even specific categories, holistically. So for anything on our, IT hardware spend or office supply spend, we have X payment terms with said vendor, but it's auto set up so that if we pay that early, we actually get a bit of a rebate, and that can add up to quite a significant amount of money over a significant period of time. Certainly, if you're buying in vast quantities. But again, it's case by case. What matters most here? Do we want to hold on to our cash longer, or actually would we benefit from having a bit of a saving there? Which again, these are things that can be put into some form of contractual agreement between the parties. So I think open mind again. I think case by case, what matters most to you, category specific, even region specific, etc. But it's a great question, Mike, because it's not just about looking at extending payment terms. There is the ability to look at how we could shorten payment terms and make it work for both parties.
All right. Well, then I think probably on that note, I think we've come to time. We could easily keep talking longer. But Adam, thank you so much for being with us to answer all of our questions, all of the audience's questions. Phil, good to have you, even from your spot on the road in Canada. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, of course, to everybody who's joined us live. Thank you if you're watching or listening later on demand. We appreciate you all being with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. Take care.